This chant is part of a spoken encyclopedia called the Veda. It is at least 5,000 years old and may represent the oldest body of technical knowledge known to man, with references to television, atomic energy, and interplanetary travel. Committed to paper 400 years ago, it is still the target of intensive research by scholars such as Padmasri Sivaramamurthy, the director of the National Museum of India.
In ancient India, as all over the world, they had a desire to travel in the sky. We have the aerial car of the god of light Surya mentioned in the Rig Veda itself. We have also the Pushpaka Vimana, the wonderful aeroplane that could carry any number mentioned in the Ramayana. A real aerial car managed by an engine. The rishis could transport themselves to any planet that they wanted because of their siddhi.
A force known as Sidli was said to exist in the world of the ancients. Using Sidli, they could transport themselves anywhere on Earth, into the skies, and finally to other planets. What was Sidli, and who brought it to Earth? If the tales and images of space travel were limited to India, they could be dismissed as the product of overworked imaginations. But how then could we account for primitive drawings in the rocks of Indio County, California? In the 20th century, we accept the existence of spacecraft. What event could possibly have inspired this 14,000-year-old drawing of a spaceship landing on the Earth? On a rocky plain in the Andes called Toro Muerto, hundreds of petroglyphs depict the same scene. Are ancient figures with spacesuit-like costumes the record of beings actually encountered? And where did the Indians of Colombia find models for these golden helmeted figures sculpted more than 1,000 years ago? The same people molded these golden objects, which look startlingly like a modern delta-wing jet fighter plane.
Alexandria was ideally suited to be the world's new center of thought, culture, and activity. As Alexander the Great looked out into the empty harbor, what did he envision as the future for the city that would bear his name? And why would the warrior Alexander even care about a library? Long before Alexander entered Egypt, generations of Greeks struggled with early riddles of existence. It was the beginning of man's understanding of the natural world. Investigation of everything was important. Athens, Greece, became the brain power center of the old Greek world. Conversation and debate were common pastimes. Public speaking produced public scholars who became celebrities. In the 5th and 4th centuries BC, men like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were working in Athens. They were the popular and controversial policy makers of the day. Their early teachings are the foundation for modern thought. But what did these early intellectuals have in common with one of history's finest generals, Alexander the Great?
The tradition is that Alexander was taught by Aristotle. And Aristotle, of course, was taught by Plato, who in turn was taught by Socrates. Plato and Socrates believed that the senses mislead you, that if you can see it, you shouldn't really believe it. They believed in eternal, unchanging truths, which are known by the mind, not by the senses. Aristotle turned this around. Aristotle said, no, nothing enters the mind except through the senses. And he, in turn, taught Alexander the Great.
Alexander was born to the ruler of Macedon, the most rapidly expanding state in the Greek world. Naturally, King Philip wanted the best tutor in the land for his royal son. So at age 13, Alexander, the soon-to-be great, was turned over to Aristotle of Macedonia. The philosopher filled the young warrior with a passionate love of learning.
Educated men are as much superior to uneducated men as the living are to the dead. The fate of empires depends on the education of youth. Aristotle the philosopher, 4th century BC.
Could flight have played a role in the construction of this rocky fortress in Peru? Called Ollantaytambo, it spans a pass through the mountains that link the jungle with the sea. The Inca builders were accomplished stonemasons who built a chain of fortresses across the Andes. Nowhere is there an explanation for the technology used to carry enormous pink slabs, each one more than 60 tons, from this mountain where they were quarried, across the river and valley, and then 10,000 feet up the face of Ollantaytambo. Could it be explained by a force known in ancient India as Sidley? Cuzco, once the capital of the Inca Empire, is a mixture of Spanish and Inca architecture. The walls of this street contain a stone that has 12 angles cut within it. So tightly do the stones fit that no mortar was ever used to join them together, and not even a knife blade can be slipped between the joints. The wall once formed a part of an Inca temple of the sun. The Spanish conquistadors used the walls built by the Inca as the foundation of a church. In 1950, an earthquake shattered Cuzco, virtually destroying the church. Today, the people of Cuzco are still rebuilding the church atop the ancient earthquake-proof structure. The original walls, however, remain standing. Again, the question arises, did the Inca receive this building technology from the original colonists? The strangely knotted strings are called quipu. No one today can read them. But when the Spaniards first came to Peru, the Inca kings would call upon their rememberers who would consult the quipu and account for every kernel of corn and man, woman, and child in the empire. But the quipu were more than a numerical accounting system, for with it an accomplished rememberer could call forth epic poems, historic dates, and events. The knots show how the decimal system was used, but added to them were colored threads that offered subtle nuances and shades of meaning that are forever lost to us. So sophisticated was the quipu, however, that some investigators believe it was the Inca version of a computer punch card. An enormous crystal was placed in a Mochica grave more than 1,500 years ago. It is among the hardest of all minerals, yet it was cut, polished, and shaped by a technology that theoretically could not have existed at that time. Other hands carved this skull. The British Museum calls it 15th century Aztec. But why would the Aztecs, who never created naturalistic art, suddenly render in crystal a skull? The bead is turquoise, another extremely hard gemstone. It is 1,700 years old and was probably part of a necklace or bracelet. The hole in each bead has a diameter of 0.19 millimeters. Even today, we can barely drill holes that small. The ibis is native to Egypt, but it was carved into an ancient stone printing roller found on the Pacific coast of South America, 8,000 miles from Egypt. These 1,500-year-old pottery figures form a portrait collection that depicts the races of man. All are separated by time and distance, and yet somehow the potters of an Indian tribe called the Mochica catalogued races they theoretically should never have encountered.
Alexander valued knowledge as a tool for power. On his quest to conquer the world a decade later, Alexander carried Aristotle's copy of Homer's Iliad with him into battle. The warrior was also a poet. Working his massive Greek army across Asia to western India, the gifted young commander inspired admiration. His campaign to fend off Persian rule shot like a spear through the ancient world, winning Alexander the support of armies, kingdoms, and countries. In the fall of 332 BC, Alexander crossed into Egypt early in his world campaign. Egypt was then a Persian province. Egypt hailed Alexander as a liberator from Persian oppression. Welcomed as a ruler, Alexander was crowned Pharaoh of Egypt. For almost 3,000 years, Egypt had been ruled by godlike pharaohs. Those ancient pharaohs were the link between their mortal subjects and the gods themselves. Egyptian pharaohs were thought to be gods in life and after death. But Alexander was Greek, not Egyptian. He had no guarantee of an afterlife. Where would Alexander the Great find immortality? Deep into the desert at Siwa, Alexander sought the oracle of the Hidden One, the great Egyptian god Amun. Legend says Alexander had a mysterious secret. Was he the offspring not of mortal King Philip, but son of the god Amun himself?
He went to Siwa and asked the oracle of god Amun if this was true. And in a dream, he saw that the god Amun embraced his mother. So this was an assurance, a confirmation of the claim. And then he asked his father, god Amun, if he would require him to do anything. And the answer came also in a dream. King, I am god Amun speaking to you. Go and found an illustrious city at the site of the island Pharos. He immediately carried this out.
In the dream, the god Amun embraced Alexander's mother, while in reality Alexander embraced Egypt and founded Alexandria. In 332 BC, he decreed his city would be the source of learning in the known world, a cultural magnet drawing on talent from afar. At the heart of the city would be a teaching institute on which other empires could be built, a warehouse of science and literature. The library would be a self-contained universe of mental stimulation. Architects laid out the plans for the new city, while after only 6 months in Egypt, Alexander continued his aggressive adventures elsewhere. It seemed as though he would conquer the world, but in 323 BC, weakened by wounds and fever, possibly poisoned, Alexander the Great suddenly died. What would happen to his fair city? Would new rulers share Alexander's lust for knowledge? The library at Alexandria had yet to be built when his namesake died. Would the world ever see his vision?
An iron pillar was forged 1,700 years ago in India. It confounds the laws of metallurgy. Too large to have been forged in one piece so long ago, it is rust-free after 1,700 years. No less remarkable, although a mere 700 years old, is a rust-free iron tooth. Found in a Peruvian grave, It seemingly is as functional as any modern dental prosthesis. Other graves yield the suggestion that the ancient Peruvians were accomplished neurosurgeons. At the Cusco Archaeological Museum, Dr. Fernando Caballesi, professor of neurosurgery at the University of San Marcos, demonstrates.
These skulls here are just a very small sample of the tremendous amount of skulls that were found in the graves of the ancient Peruvians. I think that all in all, we have studied more than 10,000 skulls that have been unearthed. Now, these are some of the instruments that they used. This is called the tumi knife, which was used this way, just to open the scalp. This cannot be used in the bone. To open the bone, they used other bronze instruments like this, just to pry up the bone, like here, prying up the bone. There are some other odd instruments like this, just to make these indentations. And there are at least 24 different other instruments that were used also. This one here is a very interesting specimen. It shows a very persistent surgeon. You find here that this man suffered 4 operations, and he survived every one of them. Either it was a very sick man or a very persistent individual who operated on them. But he was a very good technician, because after all, these areas, especially these 2 openings, are right over very, very dangerous sites that even right now, with all the techniques that we use now, we would just be very much afraid of operating in these sites. And this man really survived these operations. In Calca, near here, near Cusco, where about, I would say, 85% of these skulls show healed trephanations. 85% of survivals from skull operations is a pretty good and excellent result.
With the founding of Alexandria, a bright new period of Greek history began. It was the dawn of new leadership and a new way of thinking. When Alexander the Great died, his Egyptian kingdom was taken over by Ptolemy, Alexander's most trusted general, who would build the library Alexander envisioned. Ptolemy I started a dynasty, a series of kings from the same family, who would rule Egypt for almost 300 years. Ptolemy I made Alexandria the capital of Egypt, but still, the city faced powerful competition from ruler generals of other countries.
One of the great mysteries of the Library of Alexandria is, where was it? Nobody's sure where it was. We think it was by the water, and that's a good bet for where it is now, under the water. We also don't know what it looked like. There are no contemporary accounts that really give a description of what the library was like. So we really wonder, what did the thing look like? Did it have 2 stories? Did it have 3 stories? Was it dark? Was it well lit? There are a lot of things we don't know about the library.
The main library was probably built close to the harbor, in the royal Greek section of Alexandria. It was thought to be in or near the palace called the Bruchion, or museum. Its research was royally funded. Many local scholars were on the king's payroll. The Ptolemies were understandably proud of their library.
There was a strong sense of obligation on the part of the Ptolemies to foster learning, which is quite remarkable in a way. It always is. When their real concerns were with power, security of the dynasty, and the problems of Egypt, which are immense. One of the things Ptolemy did was collect books, a very Greek thing to do. Collect as many books as possible. And he did it with a vengeance.
Visitors arrived with their versions of famous older literary texts. Sometimes agents were sent abroad to bring back new works. On occasion, manuscripts were donated. Even Aristotle's library was willed to the Library of Alexandria. How many scrolls were eventually contained within the libraries at Alexandria? Ptolemy's goal was to have every existing written work in the Greek world and beyond. The secondary collection, located in the Serapeum alone, was said to hold 300,000 books. But over the course of history, the collection grew even larger.
In 1947, a Bedouin boy found the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran. At least 2,200 years old, they bring us closer to the original Bible than any other source, and contain clear references to holy ones descending from the heavens. While biblical scholars study the scrolls for their theological implications, other scientists have looked to the Bible for evidence of extraterrestrial visits to the Earth. An aerospace engineer at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, Joseph Blumrich, has found in the visions of Ezekiel a technical description of a spaceship.
The prophet Ezekiel describes 4 encounters with spaceships. At first he saw clouds, fire, and he heard noise coming out from the sky, out of the north. And as they approached, apparently it came rather quite in his direction, he observed what he calls living creatures. What Ezekiel calls the living creatures had straight legs and round feet, or calf's feet sometimes they're called. And it was the description of these landing legs that made me take the book of Ezekiel serious from an engineering point of view. I have had the opportunity about 10 years ago to work with my group in my office for the development of such a landing gear for an unmanned lunar landing station. For that hypothetical vehicle, we developed the landing gear and what we call the footpad, and what Ezekiel would call the round feet.
Translating Ezekiel into engineering terms, Mr. Blumrich had these artist sketches made of a landing vehicle supported by 4 helicopter units.
What they actually are is quite interesting. Now, some helicopters, in particular in this case this one, needs protection, just some hood around to protect them against dust or weather and so on. And such sheet metal structures will have cutouts, will have humps in order to accommodate levers or rods which are below them. And they do have, they may have the distinct appearance of faces. We have a number of such face-like structures, like for instance the Gemini capsule. Then we have very interesting feature that looks like a monster.
Countless ancient manuscripts were not just stored away at the Alexandria Library. They were used as research and reference for other newer scholars. And priceless books were copied by local scribes and traded for books from other parts of the ancient world. Some of the most significant work in history could have been lost forever were it not for scrolls copied in Alexandria. Each piece had to be cataloged, perhaps cross-referenced, and put away. Librarians had to be able to retrieve the works easily, and scores of new works were coming in all the time. Along with more material for the library came more visitors. Scholars were drawn to Alexandria, which in turn enhanced its reputation as a cutting-edge center for learning and knowledge. Herophilus, the anatomist, established an in-house medical school at the Bruchion. Before Alexandria, doctors used animals to research human anatomy. Long before anesthetized operations were performed, it was rumored that scientists in Alexandria operated directly on living men. No evidence for this charge exists, but but Herophilus was among the first to perform medical examinations on humans after their death. Besides literature and medicine, the Alexandrian research under the Ptolemies favored mathematics. The founder of geometry lived in Alexandria. Euclid published a textbook that replaced all previous efforts, and he also opened a school. Little is known personally about Euclid, but one legend remains. When Euclid showed his new work to King Ptolemy, the king asked if there was an easier way to do geometry. Euclid was said to reply, "There is no royal road." Ptolemy worked tirelessly to build the library, but as he grew older, he looked to his son to govern the land of the pharaohs. And when Ptolemy died in 283 BC, Ptolemy II became the sole ruler of Egypt. The great Ptolemaic dynasty would continue almost 300 years until Cleopatra's death. How would the Ptolemies leave their mark on the Library of Alexandria?
Jericho was built more than 9,000 years ago. Here man has lived continuously for a longer period of time than anywhere else on the face of the earth. And here remains one of the most puzzling of ancient mysteries. Great walls 12 feet thick made the city impregnable. But Joshua called upon his priests to blow their trumpets, and the walls came tumbling down. But how? One theory holds that an earthquake tumbled the walls of Jericho, an earthquake that was part of an enormous planet-wide catastrophe. Around the world are indications of great disasters that might have caused the gods, themselves colonists on an alien planet, to flee impending doom. Did their departure inspire all the myths of Atlantis? Could there have been several colonies, blurred by time into the one Atlantis first reported by Plato? Are legends, in fact, the histories of visitors from afar who colonized the earth? Plato told of a fabulous kingdom that was then more than 9,000 years old. Whatever fragrant things there now are in the earth, or woods, or essences which distill from fruit and flower, grew and thrived in that land, wrote Plato. They constructed buildings about them and planted suitable trees. Some of their buildings were simple, but in others they put together different stones, varying the color to please the eye and to be a natural source of delight. They had such an amount of wealth as was never possessed by kings and potentates, and is not likely ever to be again. The entire area was densely crowded and kept up a multitudinous sound of human voices and din and clatter of all sorts night and day. There were kings' baths, and there were separate baths for women, and to each of them they gave as much adornment as possible. There were many temples built and dedicated to the gods, also gardens and places of exercise. Over the centuries, the people of Atlantis apparently succumbed to the greed that seems eventually to afflict all civilizations. Their actions must have angered the gods, for Plato tells of Zeus calling them together to inflict punishment upon Atlantis. And when he had called them together, he spake as follows. And here Plato ends his tale in mid-sentence. But the people of Atlantis had been warned, and they fled the island in haste.
The second Ptolemy fulfilled the wishes of his father and Alexander the Great, and the Library of Alexandria flourished in the 3rd century BC. Ptolemy II ruled with his sister, and under their reign, the library and museum grew and prospered. It was the golden age of Alexandria. Besides expanding the library and museum, Ptolemy II built the last of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a mammoth lighthouse on the island of Pharos. Today, the foundation of the ancient lighthouse is buried beneath this comparatively modern Islamic structure, the military fort Qayed Bay. But in Ptolemaic times, travelers to Alexandria viewed the first architecturally designed lighthouse in history, a 3-tiered marvel of construction over 400 feet tall. It took vast amounts of fuel to fire up the lighthouse. The ancients may have burned animal dung to send a powerful beacon of welcome out to the world from Alexandria. Sailors guided by the lighthouse were drawn into the library. What treasures would they find in its bounty of scrolls? The library was a storehouse for all types of literature. All the great Greek philosophers must have been represented, including the writings of Diogenes. Diogenes had been inspired by a young peasant to live in simplicity. Like the young man, Diogenes even discarded his drinking cup in favor of using just his hands. Diogenes then stripped himself of all worldly goods. He gathered a group of like-minded thinkers known as the Cynics and documented their critical views of ancient Greek society. Diogenes believed that no man could be trusted. Legend tells us of his lifelong unsuccessful search for an honest man. Diogenes looked all over town in broad daylight with a lantern to prove his cynical point. The philosophy of Diogenes the Cynic was but a fraction of the library's immense collection. Were parts of the Bible written at Alexandria? According to legend, the earliest Greek translation of the Old Testament was written in Alexandria under the guidance of Ptolemy II. He is said to have requested 70 Jewish scholars to simultaneously translate and copy the Hebrew books of law.
The text was in Hebrew, but in Alexandria there was a great and very large Jewish community. It seemed that that community was very quickly Hellenized, and that Hebrew was no longer comprehensible to them. So a Greek version was required, and it was made in Alexandria.
Named for the number of scholars who copied it, the Septuagint made the Old Testament text accessible to a wide range of people and formed the basis for countless other translations of the Bible. The Bible and all of the books in those ancient times were written on papyrus scrolls. The word paper comes from the Egyptian papyrus, the plant from which scrolls were made. Papyrus grew along the banks of the Nile. The ancients pressed wet strips of reeds side by side. They were pounded flat, and when dry, could be written on with early pen and ink.
It took a long time for a scribe to finish a book, and I don't think they looked on labor, of course, the way we do. We would go crazy trying to copy another book in longhand on papyrus, but it was a famous profession, and some scribes rose to be important people. Of course, in those days, to be able to read and write was almost magical.
Astrology and astronomy were popular sciences throughout the existence of the library in Alexandria. Many ancients believed in the influence of the stars and planets on daily life.
the belief was, of course, that as above, so below. What happened in the heavens influenced what was on Earth. So astrology was part of astronomy, and astronomers were astrologers, and astrologers were astronomers. In order to predict what happened on Earth, you had to accurately observe what happened above.
In Alexandria, Aristarchus first figured out that the Earth revolves around a stationary sun. About 100 years later, Hipparchus was the first to chart over 1,000 individual stars. He even figured out the length of a solar year, correct to within 7 minutes. Even as scholars in Alexandria solved the mysteries of the universe, the Romans were encroaching on the East. Would this royally funded oasis of knowledge survive in a rapidly changing world? In Alexandria, another Ptolemy was crowned king of Egypt in 246 BC. Ptolemy III was a conqueror. He traveled the world and returned to Alexandria with priceless Egyptian treasures stolen by the Persians 300 years before. This act of restoration earned the third Ptolemy the title of benefactor. Under his reign, the tradition of learning thrived in Alexandria for another generation. About 235 BC, the honorable position of chief librarian was filled by Eratosthenes. In keeping with tradition, the influential scholar also served as tutor to the royal family. 40-year-old Eratosthenes was skilled in a variety of subjects, from poetry to science.
Eratosthenes is the first one to figure out the circumference of the Earth. Now, it's important to note, we were all taught in school that Columbus is the one who showed that the Earth was round. Educated Greeks knew that the Earth was round well before Columbus. Even in one of Socrates' dialogues, he says, when we describe the Earth, we know that it's a sphere suspended in the heavens. So it was known that the Earth was round. The question is, how big was it?
By observing shadows cast in Alexandria and in the south of Egypt at noon on the same day, and calculating the difference between the size of each shadow and the distance between the two ancient cities, Eratosthenes was able to figure out the circumference of the Earth. He said the Earth was 24,650 miles around. Amazingly, he was accurate to within roughly 200 miles. A contemporary of Eratosthenes, called Archimedes, was a visitor to Alexandria. Perhaps the most celebrated of ancient mathematicians, Archimedes studied weights and measures in what we now call physics. Archimedes' principle on water displacement is still referred to today. On discovering this ancient clue to modern science, Archimedes is remembered for his cry of Eureka, meaning, I have found it. On leaving Alexandria, Archimedes returned to his homeland in Syracuse, Sicily, to continue his studies and inventions. When Syracuse was conquered in 212 BC, Archimedes was killed by Roman soldiers. He was said to be in the midst of a math problem when he was taken away to die. The library in Alexandria was thriving around 250 BC, while the rest of the world was making landmark strides as well. In the mid-3rd century BC, the Mayan calendar was perfected in the Mexican region of Yucatan. While in Rome, the public witnessed the first competition of gladiators. And in Rhodes, another ancient wonder was built, as construction was completed on the 100-foot statue, Colossus. At the height of its popularity, scores and scores of high-level minds came through Alexandria. But over time, the luster of the library began to fade. The reign of the fourth Ptolemy marked the beginning of the decline of the dynasty and of the library. Other world centers of knowledge emerged as replacements. Near the Aegean Sea, the library at Pergamum was a rival to Alexandria in culture and splendor. And as the influence of the Romans spread out through the world, even Egypt's great Ptolemaic dynasty came under the threat of Roman rule. In 48 BC, when the Roman general Julius Caesar came to Egypt, the ruler of the land was 19-year-old Queen Cleopatra. Cleopatra is perhaps the most famous and fabled of all the Ptolemies. The mythology surrounding Cleopatra begins with her very heritage.
We often think of her as an Egyptian. No, she was a pure-blooded Greek. She was the direct descendant of that Ptolemy who was one of Alexander's field commanders. She was the undoubted pharaoh, the god queen of Egypt. She had high intellect and was quite an extraordinary person by any standards.
Cleopatra faced Julius Caesar without fear. Although Caesar came to conquer Egypt, Queen Cleopatra instead claimed Caesar's heart. On their first meeting, she was said to have emerged naked before him and disarmed the brilliant Roman with her charming manner and political savvy. For beyond her seductive nature, Cleopatra possessed admirable military skills and a keen intelligence.
The important thing is that Cleopatra was really an intellectual. Of all the Ptolemies, Cleopatra was the only one who could speak Egyptian. It was known that she could greet the people who came to her court in their own languages, and probably when Caesar came and when Antony came, she could talk to them in Latin. So Cleopatra would have had an active interest in the library, almost certainly, as an intellectual. There are even traditions that Cleopatra wrote works which might have been in the library.
It was during the reign of Cleopatra that we may discover the first clues to the beginning of the destruction of the great library at Alexandria. When Cleopatra struggled for rulership of Egypt against her co-ruler and brother, Caesar sided with Cleopatra and found himself embroiled in an Alexandrian civil war. But Caesar's navy was no match for the fine Alexandrian vessels, and soon he was surrounded in the harbor.
Caesar found himself encircled, resorted to the use of fire, and he set fire in the enemy's ships. The fire destroyed ships at sea and in the docks. And here the account of Caesar himself stops. A century later, we have more details that the fire was not limited to the ships, but extended to the closer parts of the city, near to the harbor. And Plutarch, who knew Alexandria very well and who visited Alexandria, says that the fire extended from the docks to the great library of Alexandria.
According to the ancient historian Plutarch, the library was accidentally destroyed by a fire which spread from the harbor. But some modern historians believe the fire destroyed warehouses containing only a portion of the Alexandrian scroll collection. Did the Library of Alexandria rise from the ashes to continue its tradition of teaching? After Caesar's death in 44 BC, his successor, Mark Antony, offered Queen Cleopatra thousands of books purchased from the rival library at Pergamum. This offering was perhaps made to replace the books burned by Caesar. Mark Antony, like Caesar before him, sided with Cleopatra against the opposition in Alexandria. But in 31 BC, the two were defeated at the sea battle of Actium. Mark Antony committed suicide, and his lover, Queen Cleopatra, soon followed suit. Legend tells us she placed a snake to her breast, and soon after being bitten by the asp, succumbed to its poison and died. More probably, Cleopatra drank a poison which killed her. But whatever the cause, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had founded and funded the Library of Alexandria, ended with the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC. If civil war in Alexandria and the demise of a dynasty could not destroy the tremendous library, what could? With the end of Ptolemaic rule in 30 BC, Alexandria became the capital of a Roman province claimed by the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, who was the first Roman emperor. By then, Alexandria was home to more than 300,000 people. The city itself enjoyed a resurgence of energy, which had been absent in the last half-century. But under Roman influence, the library did not flourish as it had in the past. But still, the Library of Alexandria continued to produce scholars bent on discovery. Claudius Ptolemy, a Roman of Greek descent, was born around the end of the 1st century AD. He was educated at the library and museum and published books on world geography and science. Using the work of Hipparchus before him, Claudius wrote volumes of works on astronomy and astrology. Claudius promoted the idea that the Earth was the center of the solar system. This became known as the Ptolemaic system of astronomy and was used up through the 16th century.
I know that I am mortal and ephemeral, but when I scan the circling spirals of the stars, no longer do I touch Earth with my feet, but sit with Zeus himself and take my fill of the ambrosial food of the gods. Claudius Ptolemy.
Claudius Ptolemy lived during a relatively peaceful time in Roman history. But by 200 AD, Alexandria faced invasion and plunder from abroad. The most important days of learning and knowledge had passed from the great city forever. The story of what precisely caused the overall destruction of the library may be lost to time. Accounts from various sources conflict with one another and with modern historians. The subject remains controversial. By 400 AD, paganism was outlawed, and Christianity prevailed as the official religion of the Roman Empire. The Emperor Theodosius ordered the destruction of all monuments and temples which did not honor Christianity. Pagan scholars were murdered in the streets, and during a time of constant ethnic confrontation and rebellion, the library may have been destroyed by the Christians. In 616, Alexandria was overtaken when the Persians conquered Egypt. That same century then brought Arab conquest of the land of the pharaohs, and with it, the Islamic religion of Mohammed. Was this the point in history the library was finally destroyed?
I think most people today who studied the problem would say that the real destruction came when the great Muslim army crossed the Delta, took and sacked the city.
Alexandria surrendered to the Arabs, who decreed that if the library's contents contradicted the Islamic faith, the book should be destroyed. And if they supported the Islamic faith, the books were unnecessary and should be destroyed. Either way, legend tells us that the Arab rulers ordered all of the books in the Alexandrian collection to be burned. All of the stories surrounding the decline and destruction of the Alexandrian library may combine to provide the truth. Perhaps the great institution died by degrees. Caesar's fire here, the lack of funding there, the Christian Revolution, Muslim invasion, and finally, the coastal climate of the fine port city may have contributed to the loss of the largest collection of scrolls in antiquity. Whatever may have remained could have just disintegrated. Perhaps what is important is not how the library disappeared, but that it ever existed.
Then Zeus must have spoken, for the island was shattered by what may have been the most powerful volcanic explosion ever known. Immense tidal waves and earthquakes followed the eruption. Scientists dated the catastrophe at approximately 1500 BC. This same chronology coincides with biblical and other accounts from all over the world that speak of or hint at incredible natural disasters. In Plato's time, this island was known as Thera. Today it is called Santorini. Was it also once the site of the fabled empire of Atlantis? We may never know. But the ruins of some ancient civilization are here, buried under a 250-foot layer of ash and pumice that covered the island 3,500 years ago. Was this the end of the beginning? The moment when all advanced forms of technology and culture vanished from Earth? Could their destruction be remembered now only as myths? Might such myths extend even beyond the Earth to incredibly dim memories of catastrophes suffered on other planets? Light years from our sun, in the constellation of Bootes, there is a red giant called Epsilon. It is circled by a planet that may once have supported life. Some scientists believe that a space probe was sent from that planet toward the Earth. They believe the probe received these signals in 1927. They were the first radio signals sent from Earth into space. These echoes have a different delay pattern. There is no natural explanation for the difference. Duncan Loonan, of the British Interplanetary Society, has interpreted the echo pattern as a message from the space probe, a message from a dying planet in Epsilon Bootes.
The star has become what we call a red giant. If we look at this painting here, it can illustrate the point. What has happened is that the star has exhausted its reserves of hydrogen in its core. In this situation, the inhabitants of the planetary system would find themselves in real danger. Their own planet would get hotter. In time, all the planets would get very hot. They would have, in other words, to perfect first interplanetary and then interstellar travel in order to get away from the sun. So the probe then came to the Earth. It came to the solar system. It located the Earth. It came into orbit around the Earth, and it began looking for signals, radio intelligence signals from Earth that would indicate the presence of intelligence. All the star maps, all the diagrams that I've interpreted as star maps, seem to confirm this indication that it was about 13,000 years ago that the probe got here, and it had finally been activated by our radio signals in the 1920s. Was it doing it because it was signaling home that it had been activated? If so, and if there's anyone there to hear it, perhaps in about another 150 years we could expect to hear something from these people. It's possible that in the course of our history and in the last 13,000 years that ships from Epsilon Bootes have come here, have conducted survey missions, possibly even had small settlements established here for a time and pulled out again.
It is possible that visitors from Epsilon Bootes arrived 13,000 years ago. Perhaps a city in Peru, abandoned 3,000 years ago, was the base. It once held 100,000 people. Why did they flee? We will never know, for they left nothing of themselves. no trace of their presence except a silent city of mud walls. Might they have been colonists recalled to base in the face of an impending catastrophe? What happened here, on this windy plain, halfway between the sea and the sky? The only witness is a mute stone god who looks out at the ruins of a once great civilization and weeps. It has been estimated there exist 50,000 civilizations, more advanced than the one we know. If only one of those civilizations saw its sun dying, it could have seeded the Earth. Someday, somewhere in the galaxies, we may encounter life that is remarkably similar to ourselves, and we will be able to confirm that the faint traces of ancient mysteries are the imprints of our ancestors from space.